Chapter 1691. Kaim froze, but his instinct told him to catch Yi Liangqiu in time. However, he only managed to catch her before Qin Anlin carried her away. Liangqiu. President Qin, who was originally holding Xia Mian in his arms, looked at his wife anxiously. The momentum of wanting to buy a TV disappeared in an instant. Yi Liangqiu's face was pale, and her lips were almost colorless. On the light-colored evening gown she was wearing, a bright red stain was glaring under the lights. Ah, could it be a miscarriage? A female reporter covered her mouth and screamed with red eyes. How pitiful. She was humiliated on the red carpet by her own husband and a small-time artist under her company. How pitiful. The reporters all aimed their cameras at Yi Liangqiu's blood-stained gown and believed the female reporter's words. Women knew this the best. Mr. Yi was pregnant, and it was highly possible that she had a miscarriage due to the sudden shock. In fact, even if it was impossible, the reporters still hoped that it was possible. After all, the more gossip there was, the more money they could make. Qin Anlin held Yi Liangqiu in his arms. His face was livid and pale, and it was even worse than the fainted Yi Liangqiu, miscarriage. Of course, he knew it was impossible, because she was on her period. However, he naturally wouldn't explain such a private matter to others. So, he picked her up and walked towards the limousine at the entrance. In his heart, there was a touch of panic and fear. Xia Mian stood there, still in a daze. She murmured, how could she be pregnant? It's impossible. She opened her eyes, and the glaring lights shone on her face. It was as if she was standing on an empty stage, and the malicious and mocking gazes were all aimed at her. She stood there like a clown. She was all alone. At this moment, she felt like she had been beaten back to her original state. Those lights were very hot. Her face was hot, and it was extremely uncomfortable. Her entire body seemed to be bound by something, and even breathing was painful. She screamed at those who mocked her and looked down on her. She didn't have a miscarriage at all. She didn't, she faked it. She's despicable. The surroundings immediately quietened down. It was so quiet that even the sound of a pin dropping could be heard clearly. All eyes fell on Xia Mian again, and they were filled with disdain. Xia Mian had walked the path of a pure and innocent girl, but now, her image had been completely destroyed. No matter how one looked at her, she was just a scheming bitch who destroyed other people's families. Xia Lu's red lips opened slightly, looking at the cameras silently. She suddenly covered her face. So dazzling, so dazzling. She lost. She was utterly defeated. She thought that she had won, but Yi Liangqiu turned the tables with a little trick. She suddenly turned around, and her light blue dress looked particularly cold in the night wind. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked at the direction in which Qin Anlin had gone. He didn't have a trace of nostalgia, never. She was being wishful thinking. Qin Anlin carried Yi Liangqiu directly into the car, and Kaim had already come back to his senses. Although he knew that Mr. Yi was acting, he still had to put on a good show, right? Kaim started the car and asked calmly, President Qin, which hospital are we going to? Xingyuan. Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse. Chapter 1692. The car drove steadily. Qin Anlin held Yi Liangqiu in one arm and took out his phone with the other. Yi Liangqiu buried her face in his chest. Through the fabric of his shirt, she could feel his heartbeat. It was beating really, really fast. Her fingers slowly tightened around him, bit by bit. She opened her eyes and closed them slightly. She sighed. Anlin, I don't want to go to the hospital. You're awake. His voice was still hoarse. He held her with one arm and answered the call with the other. He hung up after saying a few words to the person on the other end. She buried her face in her waist and said in a very small voice, "Anlin, I didn't have a miscarriage." "I know." He raised his head slightly and tightened his jaw. "After we go to the hospital, I won't care about you anymore." As he said this, he seemed to be explaining and trying to convince her, but more like he was trying to convince himself. After all, this time, it was also because of me. As soon as he said this, both of them felt their hearts tremble. They both remembered the crazy things they had done in the past few nights. She had menstrual pain and fainted from the pain. More or less, it had something to do with his lack of self-control. She didn't say anything else. She just tightened her fingers around his waist. Kaim glanced at his boss in disdain. What a useless boss. Where was his previous coldness? He was taken down in a few moves. Poor Xia Mian. She finally had a good dream, but she woke up so soon. However, Mr. Ye's miscarriage would probably put President Qin in a very passive position. Chen Shimi's hat was firmly on him. Besides, President Qin's heart was easily softened, but Mr. Ye's heart was ruthlessly hard. As Kaim was thinking about this, the car had already arrived at Xinyuan Hospital. At the entrance of the hospital, paparazzi were already waiting there. They immediately took photos of Yi Liangqiu being admitted to the hospital. Coupled with the late-night arrival of the famous obstetrician and gynecologist, Dr. Mei, further confirmed that it was a miscarriage. Qin Anlin couldn't care less at this time. He carried her to the examination room. Dr. Mei examined her and looked a little serious. Her blood flow is not smooth. She didn't take care of herself during the confinement period. Plus, she didn't pay attention to keeping warm during her period. That's why she suddenly fainted. Qin Anlin looked down at Yi Liangqiu with an unfriendly expression. However, she flew over with a sentence, "You should go to the tail teeth. Kaim has already gone back for me." His voice was heavy. "You're only worried about this now." Yi Liangqiu nodded very sincerely. Looking at him, he smiled faintly. "Yes. However, the one who should be worried is you. President Qin." He was extremely displeased by the word CEO Qin and glared at her for a long time. Dr. Mei, who was watching from the side, felt both angry and amused at the same time. They were both big bosses and close married couples, but when they quarreled, they were still as shameless as children. "I'll go get the medicine. You two, keep arguing." Dr. Mei shook her head and smiled. "As long as you don't call me out in the middle of the night again, I'll be happy." She then walked out. Just then, a young nurse on duty came in and brought a set of clothes. "President Qin, this is what you asked for." Just then, a young nurse on duty came in and brought a set of clothes. "President Qin, this is what you asked for." Qin Anlin reached out to take it. He nodded and closed the door. At that moment, she was still wearing an elegant evening gown. He couldn't take his eyes off her the first time he saw her tonight. Chapter 1693. However, he forced himself to look away. He told himself not to be soft-hearted towards her. But in the end, his heart still soft-hearted. He took the clothes over and said faintly, "Change your clothes." She lowered her head and buried her face in her arms. "Yi Liangqiu." He raised his voice slightly, but she still didn't respond. Finally, he pushed aside her long hair and realized that she had fallen asleep. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes, and his expression didn't look good. How could she still fall asleep in such a situation? He patted her face, but she reached out and hugged his arm. She hugged him shamelessly like a little koala bear. She buried her face in his arm and murmured, "Anlin, I'm very sleepy, so tired." His body trembled, and he looked at her with a burning gaze. She was rarely vulnerable, but her vulnerability was usually because she had something to ask for. He reached out and caressed her slightly opened lips, and his voice was already hoarse. Yi Liangqiu, I can't believe you anymore. Just like today, when he carried her into the car, he suspected that it was just a trick, but he still carried her into the car without hesitation. Because even if there was a 1% chance that she would faint, he didn't dare to take the risk. But Liangqiu, it's just wishful thinking on my part, isn't it? Everything you say to me, everything you do, is just an act. It's just a small trick to compete with me, isn't it? She didn't answer him because she was really tired to the point of falling asleep. Her breathing was long, and her body was soft. He bent down and looked at her closely. Although she had makeup on, there was still a faint green under her eyes, and he could tell that she was overworked. Qin Anlin hesitated for a moment, and he reached out to cover her back. Her skin had always been good, and it was as smooth as cream. He reached out to pull it down for her, and the smooth fabric slid down to her waist. It was like a peeled flower bud, and the inside was soft and tender. His gaze seemed to be on fire, and he stared for a long time. Finally, he removed everything and gently put on the thick clothes for her. He put them on one piece at a time, and he even put on a thick tampon. But after a while, he suddenly remembered that she was wearing a gown and he couldn't find a tampon. So she used tampons. Because of this thought, his handsome face slightly blazed up, and his face was also a little hot. After careful consideration, he still personally went to verify it. Indeed, she had used a tampon. Would it be comfortable inside? Was it comfortable with him inside? He snorted softly and helped her take it off. At this moment, she finally woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Her voice was a little fuzzy. Anlin. Don't use this anymore. It's not safe or hygienic, he said gruffly. Then, she saw the thing in his hand and blushed. Why did you? Embarrassed and angry, she simply didn't know what to say. Qin Anlin went to wash it off. When he turned around, she had already adjusted her clothes. She sat up and buried her face in her coat. Are you shy? His voice was cold. How can you not be sick when you're on your period? After saying that, he picked up the thin t-shirt and looked at her coldly. Yi Liangqiu snatched it from him and stuffed it into the bag together with the gown. You were the one who deliberately humiliated me by making me attend the party, and in the end, she sneered. President Qin, did I forget to congratulate you? He looked at her. What do you think? Chapter 1694. Qin Anlin looked at her pale face and suddenly realized something. You fainted. You faked it. She didn't deny it. Instead, she said lightly, am I supposed to sit still and wait for President Qin's attack? So, you pretended to faint. He narrowed his eyes. Although he had guessed it, he was still a little angry. Yi Liangqiu chuckled. What else could I do? Qin Anlin stared at her for a while and then asked slowly, I'm just curious. What's the matter with the blood on your dress? Don't tell me it's bleeding from inside. There was no blood on her underwear, so the blood on her dress was really suspicious. Yi Liangqiu raised her hand. Her nails were a little long. She opened her red lips and said, a little blood. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. He couldn't believe his ears. She was really something. President Qin reminded me to be careful. So, I thought it might not be a bad thing to plan for rain. She was still indifferent. This time, Qin Anlin didn't get angry. Instead, he smiled. Yi Liangqiu, I underestimated you. She smiled. I'm afraid Xia Mian's character is going to be ruined. Her smile was a little hateful. I'm very curious. Why did you drag Xia Mian down with you? Is it because you knew she would die sooner or later, so you used her as a cannon fodder? Qin Anlin looked a little gloomy. It has nothing to do with Mr. Yi. She smiled gently. Suddenly, she stood up and hugged him. She buried her face in his neck. Anlin, don't use others to anger me. I won't do that, okay? They would compete, but not others. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to stand it. Her voice was calm and didn't have many ups and downs. There was only a little jealousy in it. But in his ears, it was like a stormy sea. So, your heart can also hurt. His hand gripped her shoulder and firmly pushed her away. His gaze was cold. Yi Liangqiu, you should bear all of this. She stubbornly tried to hug him, but he pushed her away. Her hand was raised in midair, and she felt a little helpless. For the sake of the child, I won't go too far, but Yi Liangqiu, if you dare, I promise you'll regret it. He leaned close to her and said in a low and hoarse voice, you should know my bottom line. She understood that what she was about to do now was to challenge his bottom line. She smiled at him and stepped back. So he knew her decision and backed away. In the middle of the night, they looked at each other in the cold hospital. After a long time, he said, I'll ask the driver to pick you up. She didn't move. Instead, she calmly replied, there's no need for that. A person who has a miscarriage should stay in the hospital for a few days, right? He was furious. Yi Liangqiu. Too much, aren't I? She smiled, but there wasn't a trace of a smile in her eyes. Go and clarify the relationship between you and Xia Mian. I'll say, you're not pregnant. He glared at her, but she was fearless. Qin Anlin had never seen such a shameless and shameless woman. But this woman was his wife, the woman he loved and hated. He couldn't do anything to her. His overwhelming hatred was always dispelled by her shamelessly. Every time he hardened his heart, he couldn't help but soften in front of her. And this despicable woman seemed to be determined to get him. Chapter 1695. Qin Anlin glared at her. She didn't avoid his gaze at all. She stared back at him hatefully. After a long time, he lightly laughed, and his fingers lightly caressed her red lips. His voice was hoarse as he said, Yi Liangqiu, very good. I won't clarify. He looked at her mockingly. Then you can just announce the miscarriage. He turned around and was about to leave and she called out to him anxiously. Qin Anlin. He didn't turn around, he just stopped, and his cold and clear voice sounded out. Yi Liangqiu, think it over before you make a decision. There was a hint of threat in his tone. How could she not understand? She glared at him. For a long time, she didn't say anything. As for him, he opened the door gently and paused for a moment. He turned around and looked at her quietly. Liangqiu, take good care of yourself. She felt as though the blood in her body had frozen and her throat was blocked by something. She couldn't speak for a long time. He was really angry. However, she wouldn't admit it wrongly. She didn't do anything wrong, nor did she have a choice. This day would come. A few days ago, she just couldn't bear to part with him. It was just that, they couldn't bear to. Her lips moved, but his gaze was slightly tense. Neither of them spoke. After a long time, he finally turned around and closed the door gently. In the middle of the night, that slight sound finally broke through her defenses. All her pretense and strength were broken. She was so fragile and needed him so much. So, when someone else appeared beside him, her heart would hurt so much. She rushed out without even wearing her shoes. The hospital corridor was so cold that there wasn't a single trace of human life. Her feet felt as though she was stepping on ice blades. However, she couldn't care less. Right now, she just wanted to find him. She just wanted to be with him. She just wanted to feel his warmth. Even if it was cold, she wanted it. Even if he wanted to push her away and hate her, at this moment, she wanted to hug him. The elevator was on the same floor. She pressed the button but there was no one inside. Where did he go? She was flustered and turned around. She leaned against the wall of the elevator and gasped for air in the cold. Her eyes, searching everywhere, looking for him. At the end of the dark corridor, a small window shone with a trace of light. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips tightly. She felt that they were dry, so she licked them. Her hand gripped tightly as she stared at him in the dark. He stood there smoking and did not go away. Why didn't you leave? Her voice trembled, hoarse. His slender fingers held the cigarette, and the red sparks rose and fell with his movements. He just stood there, gazing at her deeply, and did not answer. Finally, she walked over, step by step. It was very difficult. She walked until she was in front of him and was able to look up at him. In the dim light, there was a thin layer of moisture in her eyes, making her look extremely fragile. She didn't want to wipe it off. She just looked at him stubbornly and said stubbornly, "Qin Anlin, you are mine." He did not move. He just took another puff of his cigarette and said in a hoarse voice, "I can't guarantee that." She went forward and wanted to hug him, but her hand was caught by him. He held her fist easily and looked at her with an unfathomable gaze. "Yi Liangqiu, you're the one who gave up." Chapter 1696. She lifted her head and her eyes were bathed in tears. She wanted to hug him, but he kept her at a distance. No matter how much he cared for her in front of others, she was the only one who knew that his heart was filled with hatred and he couldn't contain her anymore. He was already extremely kind to her. She stood in the middle of the cold night. It was almost the new year. Outside the window, there would be fireworks every now and then. As the fireworks rose, the light illuminated his handsome face. She could also see the pain and struggle in his eyes. She finally said, "Anlin, at that time, could you forgive me?" What she wanted was a promise from him, but he couldn't give it to her. His voice was slightly cold. "Liangqiu, perhaps I've made you misunderstand me these past few days." He continued calmly, "I've said it before, it's impossible for us to be together. You've adapted well, haven't you?" She stood there stiffly, listening to his words, every word hammered into her heart. Yes, how could she be so naive? How could he forget his mother's death? How could he forget that she was Su Shiqing's daughter? How could he forget that she had brought back a pile of ashes? She had actually thought that he had forgiven her. It turned out that she wasn't the one who had bewitched him. She was the one who had been bewitched. He had always been clear-headed, always. The indulgence he had given her was what he was willing to give her. There was nothing else, really. Perhaps he was more suited to playing games than she was. She took 2 steps back and lightly rubbed her white toes against the cold floor tiles. After a long time, she raised her head and a faint smile appeared on her face. "I understand." She pretended to be relaxed. "Qin Anlin, I was like that just now because of period cramps." "I know." His voice was deep. How can Mr. Yi be so emotional? He put out his cigarette and looked at her deeply. "I'm leaving." This time, he left without any hesitation, leaving her in the dark. The fireworks outside the window were still burning, one after another. The light from the fire illuminated her face. She stood in the cold and her body was very cold. Finally, she cried like a child. In the middle of the night, she cried her heart out. She couldn't stop. She felt abandoned. When Dr. May came over, she was shocked. Liangqiu, what's wrong? Looking at her bare feet, he felt sorry for her and couldn't help but reprimand her. You're already not feeling well, yet you still don't take care of yourself. Looking at her, Dr. May could roughly guess what was going on. She sighed. Aunt May, I don't know why you're doing this, but I believe that you love Anlin. He held her shoulders and pulled her into his arms. Be strong. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes, but her tears never stopped. After a while, she slowly stepped back and squatted down. What should I do? I don't want to do that at all. I don't want to see him look at me like a stranger. I don't want to see him with someone else. But I still incite his anger again and again. She clenched her fists. I thought that I could hold it in, that I wouldn't care so much. I was sure that I was the only one in his heart, but I still feel terrible. It was extremely uncomfortable. With every step she took, she was in danger of losing him completely. He was already telling her that if she continued, he would really dare to have someone else with him. For the first time, she was confused. She wanted to throw caution to the wind, but she just realized how weak she was. Chapter 1697. Yi Liangqiu was at a loss. But she never had a way out. She could only move forward. No matter how painful it was, no matter how scared she was, she could only move forward. She loved him. No matter how painful it was, she couldn't bear to let him know his mother's pain. She loved him. From the bottom of her heart, Qin Anlin was still the man who couldn't sleep. In a woman's heart, she softly treated her man as a child. A few days before the spring festival, Yi Liangqiu stayed at home and didn't go out. She saw Xia Mian's tears on TV and various media, trying to prove that she wasn't the third party. But she didn't deny that there was something between her and Qin Anlin. In the end, she still left some leeway. What was particularly interesting was that she hinted that Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu had been separated for more than a year. How could they have a miscarriage after living apart for more than a year? She really admired her intelligence. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly, took out a CD, and made a call. She called Xia Mian's cell phone on New Year's Eve. The call was quickly connected. Xia Mian picked up the phone. Yi Liangqiu's voice was very calm. Xia Mian, here's something for you and Che Taixian. You didn't forget it, did you? Xia Mian was stunned. After a while, she gritted her teeth and said, Yi Liangqiu, you're despicable. Really? Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly. Now you should prepare how to deal with the media. By the way, Qin Anlin has always known about this. She paused. From the beginning to the end, he knew everything, including how you climbed into Che Taixian's bed. Xia Mian was stunned. After a long time, she shook her head desperately. She couldn't believe that she had been fooled by Yi Liangqiu. The role is real. It's up to you whether you can become popular or not. As Yi Liangqiu spoke, she put the CD into the computer and clicked to upload it. Miss Xia, in about half an hour, everyone will be able to appreciate your body and skills. Think about how to deal with it. With that, she hung up the phone. She admitted that she was too impatient. She shouldn't have been so impatient, but she hated Xia Mian. Very much so. She hated Xia Mian sticking to Qin Anlin even more. She admitted that she was petty and despicable, but so what? Yi Liangqiu turned off her laptop. She didn't care how the incident developed, because it was Xia Mian and King Entertainment's business to worry about. It had nothing to do with her. Sitting on the soft sofa and drinking hot tea, a servant carried Silent down. Silently, he became plump and grew a size bigger. He could crawl and even speak a few sentences. It's the new year. You're very happy, aren't you? Yi Liangqiu hugged the little fellow and kissed him. Mommy is very happy too. Little Momo hugged his mother with his chubby arms and repeated her words, happy. Her eyes were curved as she smiled, but there was a loneliness in them that only she understood. Xiao Mian's incident had gone viral on the internet. Although the photo was taken from behind, it was obvious that it was Xiao Mian from the side. Xiao Mian's image of a pure and innocent girl had also taken a nosedive. King Entertainment held an emergency meeting. No matter what, Xiao Mian was a popular actress and had been heavily promoted recently. Since this incident had happened, they had to solve it. It wasn't for her, but for the company's reputation. At 10:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve, Qin Anlin sat at the head of the conference table. There was a trace of tiredness and displeasure on his face. Chapter 1698. But she still did it. It was ridiculous and childish. However, he still had to solve this problem. Xiao Mian sat with her head down, crying her eyes out. Ying Jie didn't say a word, and Kaim was expressionless. The other executives didn't say anything because they didn't know the relationship between President Qin and Xiao Mian. Qin Anlin looked at Xiao Mian coldly. Miss Xiao, do you want the company to solve this problem, or do you want to solve it yourself? Xiao Mian's eyes were red and swollen like a rabbit's. Hearing his words, she looked like she was shocked. After a while, she asked in a low voice, how will the company solve it? Qin Anlin looked straight at her and smiled faintly. Apologize to the public. Apologize to the public for the bad influence our artists have on society. Xiao Mian's face turned pale. She looked straight at Qin Anlin and said no in a low voice. But so what? Qin Anlin continued slowly, if you want to solve it yourself, you need to reach a settlement with Che Taixian. Xiao Mian's face was pale. Che Taixian had already returned to Korea. How could she reach a settlement? There was only one way for her to go, she was still struggling on her deathbed. All of this is Yi Liangqiu's scheme. As soon as she finished speaking, countless people looked at her with disdain. You're the one who slept with others, right? Now you're accusing others of conspiracy. Did someone force you to go to Che Taixian's bed? Qin Anlin's voice was a little cold. Miss Xia, I only want the result. His attitude was clear to everyone present. The president obviously didn't give face to the White Lotus. It seemed that there was nothing between them. Xiao Mian had been talking to herself. Under countless eyes, Xiao Mian said with great difficulty, I will give the company an explanation. Qin Anlin looked around and said lightly, that's it. We'll hold a press conference later. Kaim nodded. The reporters are waiting outside. We can hold a press conference at any time. Qin Anlin stood up. Go and get ready. When he reached the door, he suddenly paused and looked straight at Xiao Mian. If today's incident doesn't end well, I think you know the consequences. With that, he left without looking back. Xiao Mian sat there with an ugly expression on her face. She knew very well what Qin Anlin meant. If they couldn't handle it, she could only sacrifice herself. She stood up and smiled faintly. Yi Liangqiu was really ruthless. She straightened her back. She knew Yi Liangqiu's intention. Wasn't it to block the possibility between her and President Qin? The fact that she was like this was enough to prove the fear in her heart. What was Xiao Mian afraid of? She was unmarried. Wasn't it normal for her to have sex with a man? In the CEO's office of King Entertainment, Qin Anlin stood quietly in front of the French windows with a cigarette in his hand. It was 11:00 at night. Kaim entered and closed the door behind her. How are things over there? Qin Anlin asked, his voice a little hoarse. Kaim paused. Xia Mian told the reporters that she fell in love with Che Taisien at first sight. That night, she drank too much and naturally slept with him. However, she didn't expect Che Taisien to be such a scumbag. She's smart to deny everything, Qin Anlin sneered. Fortunately, Che Taisien is in Korea. Otherwise, this matter wouldn't be easy to resolve. Kaim nodded in agreement, then sighed. Xia Mian's pure and innocent persona is too tight. President Qin, the company treats her, let's just leave it at that. If we ban her, won't we fall into Yi Liangqiu's trap? Qin Anlin pursed his thin lips. Chapter 1699. Qin Anlin pursed his thin lips. Let's go back first. It's almost midnight. Stay up with your mom. Kaim nodded. Qin Anlin asked, how's she doing? Same old, not bad, not good. Kaim smiled. Sometimes she's clear-headed, sometimes she's muddle-headed. The nanny takes care of the child. Qin Anlin patted him. You've worked hard. Go back soon. As he said that, he suddenly remembered something and called out to Kaim. Wait. Kaim stopped, a smile on his face. However, it was a lonely smile, especially on a New Year's night because there was one less person. It had been almost 2 years. He hadn't seen her. It wasn't that he didn't want to, but he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to let go. He knew that she had performed well and had her sentence reduced. She had never confessed anything to him. She had never asked him to wait for her. She had only worked hard in silence. Silly Ching Ching. How could she be so silly? What if he was with someone else when she came out? However, even though his heart ached for her, he was satisfied. There was a person who was worth waiting for and waiting for him. He was actually not alone. He had never been. He thought that he should bring He Huan to see her. Kaim's face revealed a touch of gentleness. In Qin Anlin's eyes, it was filled with loneliness. Yes, Su Ching had done so many bad things, but Kaim could forgive her. As for him, he couldn't forgive Liangqiu. He couldn't find a reason to forgive her. When Qin Anlin left the company, the ancient bell of a certain building in B City rang. The GM Plaza in front of him burst into cheers and fireworks filled the sky. It was very lively. He stopped and stood there for a long time. The fireworks were lively, but it was also lonely in high school. After watching for a long time, he finally crossed the plaza and got into his car. As he sat in the car and slowly fastened his seatbelt, the side door opened and Xia Mian came in. Qin Anlin frowned at Xia Mian and said coldly, "Get out of the car." Xia Mian clenched her fists and her eyes became watery. "President Qin, I was framed." Qin Anlin's slender fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly. "So what? Other than proving that your IQ is not high enough, what else can it prove?" It was Yi Liangqiu who was too despicable. Xia Mian bit her lip and said, but Qin Anlin had no intention of listening to her. He said coldly, "Get out of the car. Otherwise, starting tomorrow, you will no longer be an artist of King Entertainment." This was the limit of his tolerance. Xia Mian still wanted to say something, but his voice was low and hoarse. "Get out of here." It was rare for him to be this angry. Xia Mian, on the other hand, disgusted him. He thought that he had overestimated her. She didn't even have the basic qualities of an artist. At this moment, Qin Anlin had made a decision in his heart. Xia Mian was startled, and her body trembled. She didn't dare to stay any longer. With her fingers on the door handle, she hesitated and got out of the car. As soon as she got out, the car drove away in a puff of smoke, leaving behind a cloud of dust. Qin Anlin drove with one hand. He glanced sideways at the place where Xia Mian had been sitting, feeling a little annoyed. The black sports car sped through the night. Along the road, there were people setting off firecrackers and fireworks. The sound was like boiling water. His expression became even colder as he drove all the way to the Qin family's old mansion. He drove onto a kapok road. The kapok trees on both sides were a little bleak because of the winter, and the lights were dim. Chapter 1700. The lights of the mansion lit up in an instant, and the black carved door slowly slid open. He drove in and parked the car on the lawn in front of the main mansion. In fact, Xia Mian's matter wasn't that important. He didn't have to solve it himself, but he still made a big deal out of it. He thought that he just didn't dare to come back. He was afraid of loneliness, and he was even more afraid of facing a home with one less person. When he entered the door with his coat, he saw Su Qingxiu sitting on the sofa. Her face, which was no longer young, was in a daze. "Aunt Su, you're not asleep yet?" Qin Anlin asked softly, his voice a little hoarse. Su Qingxiu was shocked and looked up at him. Perhaps it was because she was old, or because she had cried too much in the past 2 years, her eyes weren't good. She squinted for a long time before she could see Qin Anlin clearly. Then, she sighed. "The old lady is gone. Why didn't you come back earlier for the new year?" Qin Anlin smiled apologetically. "I had something important to deal with in the company, so I came back late." He wanted to change the topic. "Mumu and Muyun are asleep, right?" "They're all asleep. Muyun takes good care of little Mumu." Su Qingxiu forced a smile and then scolded, "Look at you, as a father. You don't even know how to spend the new year with your child. You're busy in the company. What's the big deal?" Qin Anlin smiled and didn't say anything. Su Qingxiu still doted on him. Seeing his tired look, she said, "It's cold. I'll get someone to bring a bowl of mutton soup over. It'll warm up your body." Qin Anlin was also hungry, so he didn't refuse. He casually put his coat on the sofa and let out a long breath. Su Qingxiu went to bring the mutton soup. The house was quiet. The house was still the same. Today was the midnight of the new year, but there was really nothing new in the house. Looking around, he saw a photo of his mother on the coffee table. There were a few balls of tissue in the trash can. Aunt Su must have cried again. Qin Anlin shook his head helplessly. He took the photo with his slender fingers and looked at it for a long time. Su Qingxiu held the plate at the door and stood quietly. Her voice was a little choked. "I've been with the old lady for so many years. The old lady left, and I was supposed to follow her." Qin Anlin raised his eyes and looked at the sleeve. He sighed, "Aunt Su, don't say that. It makes me feel worse." Crisp's sleeve came in and placed the plate on the table. Qin Anlin, however, lost his appetite and forced himself to eat. Su Xiu sat beside him and wiped her tears. "I should have gone, but I thought about how old mistress disappeared for no reason. I haven't taken revenge yet. How can I be satisfied?" Qin Anlin's heart sank. He seemed to understand Qingxiu's intentions. He put down the chopsticks in his hand and looked at Qingxiu. Chu Xiu's face darkened as she slowly said, "Young master, I had a dream last night." Qin Anlin grunted and looked at Milky Sleeve. "And then, I dreamed of the old lady. The old lady said that she was not living well over there." Qingxiu wiped her tears. "Poor old lady. She still thinks about young master. She was afraid that you would be lonely, so she asked me to help you find a reliable girl." Qin Anlin lowered his eyes and smiled faintly. "Aunt Su, you're confused. I'm not single. Qingxiu looked at him with her blurry eyes again. After looking at him for a long time, she shook her head. Old mistress said that she didn't dare to want a daughter-in-law like that. Chapter 1701. He paused and said in a clear voice, "Is there any difference between our relationship now and separation? The old lady's soul will be uneasy as long as she is in the Qin family's account." There was a hint of pain in Qingxiu's voice. "Young master, have you forgotten how the old lady died in vain? But I don't dare to forget for a moment." She trembled and stroked her silver hair. "I don't even dare to die. I'm afraid that I won't be able to see the end of the wicked if I die." At this moment, her expression was a little frightened and pitiful. Qin Anlin knew that she had been with the old lady since she was a child and had a deep relationship. It was normal for her to be a little extreme. He didn't want to hurt her too much, so he sighed. "There will be such a day." Qingxiu looked at him as if her eyes were on fire. "What will happen to Yi Liangqiu at that time? You will still be together, won't you? Don't you care about the old lady's feelings in the netherworld? She is the daughter of your enemy. Can you still hold her and love her until your hair turns white?" Her voice was a little harsh at the end of the sentence. Qin Anlin was very tired and smiled bitterly. "Aunt Sue, I won't. I said that I won't forgive her." He was in a trance as he said this. Won't forgive her? Really? In fact, how many chances had he given her since she came back? But she didn't want to give him a chance. Qin Anlin restrained his expression and said lightly, "Aunt Sue, take good care of yourself. Don't worry too much." He patted her shoulder. "The old lady will also hope that you live a good life in your old age." Qingxiu's tears flowed down. "The old lady is gone. What's the use of living a good life for me?" Qin Anlin didn't say anything because his heart was even sadder than hers. The dead were gone, and the living were still suffering. Over the past year or so, every day and every second had been spent in torment. He hated her, missed her, blamed her, and he couldn't tell anyone about it. If he said it, it would be unfilial. He slowly unbuttoned his suit and walked upstairs. Qingxiu stood downstairs and looked at him. In the dim light, she seemed to see him when he was a child. In the blink of an eye, he had grown up. "Young master, you must avenge the old lady." Her voice was hoarse, which made his heart tighten. Qin Anlin thought that it was time to find a suitable place for Qingxiu to live in. She was no longer suitable to live here. If she continued to live here, she would become useless. As he was thinking, he untied his tie and walked gently into the children's room. Muyun and Mumu were both asleep. Mumu was held in his brother's arms. He was obedient and sleeping soundly. He pulled off his tie, sat gently on the bed, reached out to touch Mumu's face, and then touched Muyun's forehead. Muyun woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at Qin Anlin in a daze. She murmured, "Daddy." Qin Anlin smiled faintly and reached out to rub his little head. "Why are you awake? Today is New Year's Eve." "Daddy, I want to set off fireworks." Muyun's voice was soft, not as cold as usual. Qin Anlin lowered his head and kissed him on the cheek. "It's past midnight. It's already the new year." However, he was willing to fulfill his wish. "Get dressed. Daddy will take you downstairs to set off the fireworks, okay?" Yi Muyun's eyes were stained with something like fireworks. Although he was excited, he still remembered that his sister was still asleep. He got up quietly, put on his clothes, and followed Qin Anlin downstairs. Chapter 1702. The cold night and the lively sky formed a sharp contrast. Qin Anlin watched from afar with Yi Muyun, watching the lively blooming in the sky. It's so beautiful. Yi Muyun whispered, Mommy must like it too. Qin Anlin reached out and picked up his son so that he could have a better view. After a long time, he murmured, Yes, your mommy likes it too. However, they separated after a year or two. No matter how much she liked it, they couldn't stand together to enjoy the fireworks. More than 10 fireworks were set off in turn. The sky bloomed with beauty again and again, but after it was over, all that was left was loneliness. Qin Anlin stood for a long time before he lowered his head and looked at his son. Go back to sleep, okay? It was rare that Yi Muyun didn't listen to him. I want to call Mommy. As soon as he finished speaking, his father's body stiffened. After a long time, he sighed softly. Muyun, it's late. Mommy is already asleep. Aren't we not asleep too? Little Muyun's height reached Qin Anlin's waist. He raised his little face and asked. He didn't look like his usual cold self. Instead, he looked like a child who longed for his mother. No matter how hard Qin Anlin's heart was, he couldn't bear to do that, so he took out his phone and gave it to Muyun. In fact, how could he not know that Muyun could use the home phone to call him himself? He was just looking for a chance to enjoy the feeling of having a father and mother. How could he have the heart to disappoint him? Muyun took the phone. His little body squatted there. When he spoke, his voice was also soft, and he looked at Qin Anlin from time to time. Qin Anlin was taken aback by the look in her eyes. He silently walked to the side and lit a cigarette. Little Muyun spoke for about 10 minutes before returning the phone to him. Qin Anlin looked down. It was already hung up. What did he say? With a cigarette in one hand, he took a puff and walked home with his son in the other. Muyun snorted vaguely. Daddy, I want to sleep. With that, his little face pressed against Qin Anlin's waist, looking like he was going to sleep. Qin Anlin patted his little head, feeling helpless and amused at the same time. This child. He carried the little guy upstairs and tucked him in. Little Muyun secretly opened his eyes. Qin Anlin was both angry and amused. He reached out and pinched his little face. All right, it's time to sleep. Otherwise, I'm going to spank your butt. Little Muyun laughed and hugged his sister as if he was holding a little toy. And kissed her. Qin Anlin's heart softened, and he tucked the two of them in. Just as he was about to leave, Muyun's voice sounded softly. Daddy, will Mommy come back? Qin Anlin's body stiffened. After a long time, he smiled gently. She will always be your mother. Muyun didn't say anything else and carefully said goodnight. Qin Anlin walked back and kissed the little guy's face. Good night. He got up and hugged him with a pair of little hands. The child was tall and had long arms. Hugging him felt light. Qin Anlin was reluctant and couldn't bear to let him go. Muyun never made a fuss or begged him, but it didn't mean that he didn't miss his mother. And he had been merciful to her many times. It couldn't be said that he didn't consider the child. He stayed with the little guy for a while. When he fell asleep, Qin Anlin walked out quietly. Chapter 1703. This place was still the same as before. There were red candles on the dressing table, which were used when his parents got married. She still kept them carefully. It could be seen that she had never forgotten that heartless man. Qin Anlin let out a low sigh. He carefully cleaned the bedroom and sat for another half an hour or so. This could be considered companionship. When he returned to his bedroom, he couldn't fall asleep. His body was very tired, but his consciousness was very clear. Over the years, his insomnia had never been better. He sat up, walked to the bar in the living room, poured himself a glass of red wine, and sat on the sofa by the French window, looking at the night view outside. He sat there for half the night. He held his phone in his hand and occasionally looked at it. But it was almost dawn, and he still hadn't received any messages. He smiled bitterly. What was he looking forward to? It was time to clean up the debt with the Su family and her feelings. Qin Anlin slowly got up and looked at the morning scenery outside with a slightly bitter gaze. The morning light was shrouded in a thin mist, looking a little cold. In the vast expanse of whiteness, there were branches with broken leaves, standing there alone. Qin Anlin felt that the tree was a little like him. He smiled lightly, a little bitterly. During the New Year, he asked Yi Liangqiu to meet on the second day of the Chinese New Year, which could be regarded as a reunion for the children. The location was still his apartment. Su Qingxiu didn't go, because she would probably be unhappy if she went. Qin Anlin hired 2 professional nannies, both of whom were confirmed by Keim for a long time before they took up the job. Qin Anlin was relatively relieved to use them. On the afternoon of the second day of the Chinese New Year, Yi Liangqiu came over, pushing a small cart. Silence was inside. Qin Anlin hugged Silence, while Yi Liangqiu gave the gifts she brought to Mu Yun and Mumu. Especially Mumu, she felt a little sad when she hugged him. After all, he was a little girl who was born without a mother. Although Anlin took good care of him, Yi Liangqiu still felt a little worried. After hugging and kissing him for a while, she put him down reluctantly. The nanny will take care of him. To the supermarket. Qin Anlin's voice was a little stiff. She looked up at him. What are you doing there? Qin Anlin had already walked to the door. His tone was very indifferent. Grocery shopping. She let out an ah as he stood at the door. His tone became even more indifferent. If not, what are we eating tonight? Only then did Yi Liangqiu let out an oh and walked out. He took his coat and car keys. When he saw her coming out, he opened the door and walked out first. She followed behind him because she couldn't bear to part with the children. It wasn't easy for them to see each other, and he had to take her out again. But she didn't dare to go against him, because if she dared to, he might not let her see the child again. He started the car and said calmly, "You should know what happened to Xia Mian." She grunted, but did not say anything else. What do you think? His voice was still indifferent. Yi Liangqiu looked up at him. You want me to invite Che Taixian back to avoid the rumors? To say that he and Xia Mian are actually in a business relationship? Qin Anlin snorted coldly. You're really good at joking. After that, he stopped talking about Xia Mian and asked her what she wanted to eat. Yi Liangqiu was a little confused. She turned her head to look out of the window, bit her thumb, and said in a very indifferent voice, "Will you make it?" After asking, there was a long silence. After a long time, Qin Anlin sighed. Liangqiu, will you give it to me? Chapter 1704. He squinted his eyes and smiled faintly. Then, he answered her question seriously, I'll do it. The atmosphere was different. She only responded with a and didn't say anything else. When they reached the supermarket, she followed beside him, keeping a step away from him. They were so unfamiliar. At first, he didn't mind and let her do as she pleased, choosing the ingredients by himself. After 2:00 in the afternoon, there were more and more people at the supermarket. In the end, it was so crowded that it was almost crowded. Yi Liangqiu was a little dumbfounded. Didn't these people need to celebrate the New Year? The crowd had separated the two of them, and they were now about 2 meters apart. Perhaps she had something in her heart, so she thought it was good that they got separated. She would wait for him at the entrance of the supermarket. But just as she made up her mind, he was already walking beside her, reaching out to grab her and drag her to his side. Yi Liangqiu was startled and looked at him. "Hold my hand, don't get separated." His voice was slightly cold and indifferent. She pursed her lips, her fingers gripping his cuff. Then, he threw his coat to her and asked her to hold it. This time, they were like an ordinary married couple, walking in the crowded supermarket and struggling to choose the dishes for dinner. Most of the time, she was in a daze, and he was in charge of choosing the dishes. When they were done, it was already 4:00 in the afternoon. He put the last vegetable into the shopping cart. His handsome face was still handsome, but there were some beads of sweat on his forehead. Yi Liangqiu just looked at him and didn't say anything. When they went to the front desk to settle the bill, he naturally reached out to her. "Wallet." She let out an "ah" and looked at him. "It's in the coat." His tone was calm, but his eyes were focused on her face. She was wearing a thick coat with a hat. Her long hair covered half of her face, so it was hard to tell that she was Yi Liangqiu. "Oh," he said. She quickly flipped the jacket over and took out his wallet to hand it to him. Qin Anlin paid and they went to the parking lot. She sat in the car while he moved the things into the trunk. The car swayed slightly, and she felt a little uneasy. 5 minutes later, he got into the car with a gust of cold air. His body sank into the seat, and the back of the seat made a slight sound. "Bring me a bottle of water," he ordered her. She was in a daze again. Then, as if she had bounced up, she awkwardly handed the water to him. Qin Anlin seemed to be a little hot. He opened the bottle of mineral water in the cold winter and drank half a bottle in one go. He put down the bottle and started the car. At the same time, he said slowly, "You seem very nervous." "No." She looked out the window and sighed softly. "I'm just lamenting that we can still get along so peacefully." He was silent for a while before he said, "In front of the child, we are still family, and we have to be like this." Then, he said something that shocked her. He looked at her and said calmly, "No matter what happens to us in the end, the child must have a mother and father." She shuddered and looked at him in disbelief. "The winner takes all, and you know it too. So the loser in the end doesn't have the right to ask for forgiveness." His voice was cold, but the meaning behind it couldn't be clearer. He said that he wouldn't forgive her, and they would never be able to. But now... Chapter 1705. In front of a red light, Qin Anlin stopped the car and turned his face. His voice was even colder. "Yi Liangqiu. I think you think the same as me." Her voice trembled as she called out, "Anlin." She couldn't believe that he would say that. What he meant was that no matter what happened in the future, they would still be together, even if the way they interacted wasn't the same as before. And this, to her, was already a great gift. Yes, she was so humble that she was no longer herself. He didn't make a sound. His expression was a little solemn, as if he was angry with her. In fact, he was angry with himself. The atmosphere in the car became solemn again. Then, he drove with one hand and took a cigarette from the central control with the other. He lit it up. The smell of smoke quickly filled the car, and Yi Liangqiu coughed a few times. He opened the window a little, looked at her sideways, and didn't say anything. He put out the cigarette and waited for the smoke to dissipate before closing the window. The car entered the traffic again, and his tone was calm. "After the festival, I will ask Kaim to go to ATV to discuss the cooperation." She immediately keenly sensed what he meant, and looked at him sideways. "Is it an acquisition?" He just glanced at her indifferently and didn't answer, but silence often meant acquiescence. "ATV won't agree." Her voice was soft but firm. He smiled. "I know, but I thought that in the end, you would agree." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. Although I'm the CEO of ATV, I don't have ATV shares in my hands. Qin Anlan's gaze was slightly cold. Then when the time comes, get Su Shiqing to come out. Yi Liangqiu also sneered. Wait until President Qin forces ATV to a dead end before saying that. After a while, she snorted softly. I think that even if that day comes, with Su Shiqing's personality, he would rather abandon the entire ATV than let it belong to King Entertainment. Su Shiqing was insidious, but he was also proud. Qin Anlan didn't know, but Yi Liangqiu clearly knew how much Su Shiqing cared about the Qin family. After she finished speaking, Qin Anlan's eyes shone and his voice was a little hoarse. What about you? Are you going to advance and retreat with him and ATV? Yi Liangqiu rolled down the window and looked out. Then she turned her head. No. At that time, I will come back and you can do whatever you want with me. After she said that, his body actually tensed up for a moment, and he had an indescribable urge. Do whatever you want to me, what a beautiful word. He unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt with one hand and said in a hoarse voice, You said it. She turned her head and looked at him tenderly. Anlan, I'm sorry. I can only win, I can't lose. Her words probably made him feel a little better, so he didn't make things difficult for her anymore. After driving the car back, he dismissed the 2 nannies and asked Yi Liangqiu to take care of the children while he went to the kitchen to prepare the ingredients. Mumu and Momo were both babies, so they had milk a few times a day. At 6:00, the 2 babies were hungry. Yi Liangqiu went to the kitchen to make milk. When she opened the fridge, her gaze froze. The fridge was filled with all kinds of ingredients. And before he went to the supermarket today, he said that there were no ingredients. She turned around, and Qin Anlan, who was sitting in front of the counter, looked at her indifferently. I remembered wrongly. Remembered wrongly. Chapter 1706. Yi Liangqiu nodded her head. When she turned around, the corners of her lips curled into a faint smile. He didn't mean what he said. It was clearly not like that. However, she did not refute him. She closed the fridge, walked behind him and leaned forward. Where's the milk? He was handling the ingredients. When he heard that, he turned to look at her and opened the cabinet door. Upstairs. Oh, Yi Liangqiu replied and walked over to get it. He was leaning sideways. After she walked over, he turned around again. In this way, it was equivalent to him trapping her between himself and the counter. In just an instant, her body froze. She did not dare to turn sideways. Her nose was filled with his masculine scent. Behind her, she was touching his body. It was so warm that it was almost scalding. She paused for a moment and tiptoed to get the milk powder from the cabinet. When her fingers touched it, her waist was caught by him, her fingers trembled, and so did his voice. Anlan. Following that, she was hugged tightly in his arms. His lips touched her neck and his voice was a little hoarse. Don't you have anything to say to me? Say what? Her voice was a little faint. After that, her neck was bitten and her sweater was lifted, every inch of her skin was aroused by his big palms. Her lower lip quivered as she called out his name. Her body was turned around and she sat on the counter. The cold surface of the counter temporarily calmed her down a little. She wanted to get down, but he did not allow her to. His body was stuck between hers. He lowered his body and buried his face in her neck. Anything else? He asked in a hoarse voice. She suddenly blushed and looked up. Her gaze was light, and there was a touch of moisture in it. She did not make a sound, but he knew it. His lips kissed her lightly and moved to her lips. She was a little uneasy, but it was not that she was unwilling. They were both adults, and it was a once in a long time. Hence, he was excited, and she was especially passionate. It was as passionate as the last time. In the end, the counter was completely ruined. It was a mess, and there was no way to eat. When everything had calmed down, he was still standing with his arm around her waist. Both of them were panting slightly. Yi Liangqiu buried her face in his chest, her skin touching his shirt. His sweat was all over it and it was slightly cold. After the sudden sexual incident, the atmosphere was a little subtle, but no one said anything, or perhaps they had already tacitly agreed. The game between them was too lonely, so it was understandable that they chose to temporarily comfort each other. After a long time, he finally left, and she immediately felt the chill in the air. He tidied himself up and took a tissue to clean her up. But those dishes couldn't be eaten, let alone looked at. They were all swept into the trash can, and everything had to start over. Yi Liangqiu washed her hands and made milk powder. The two babies were as hungry as calves. As she fed him, she thought about what had just happened. Her face was burning hot. After feeding, she was too ashamed to go to the kitchen to wash the milk bottle. In the end, little Mu Yun sneakily took it to the kitchen. Qin Anlin took it and glanced at it. Then, he said shyly, how could he not know what she was thinking? She was probably embarrassed. In fact, when they were in the car, he wanted her. Half of it was because he wanted her, and the other half was because he was a little angry. Chapter 1707. She had not slept in their bedroom for a long time. Although they had sex in the kitchen in the afternoon, it had only been a few minutes. If he wanted to be quick, there was nothing he couldn't solve. At this moment, she looked at the bathroom door, clutching her bathrobe. She was even more nervous than their first time. The bathroom door was pulled open and a slender figure walked out. Qin Anlin was drying his hair with a towel. He walked over slowly. Why didn't you take a shower? He was taking a shower just now. Yi Liangqiu entered the bathroom. The bathroom was filled with steam and the faint smell of shower gel. She took a quick shower, but hesitated as she went out. After a long time, she thought that he was asleep and walked out. But the moment she stepped out of the bathroom, she was hugged. Then she was pressed against the bathroom door. Her back hurt, and before she could scream, her lips were blocked. He seemed to be in a hurry as he blocked her lips and got his way. It was probably because it was very convenient and it was late at night after a shower. It was not like the time in the kitchen. But after satisfying his craving, he wanted to torture her. They hadn't done this for a long time. Her long hair was untied and spread hopelessly on the pillow. He kissed her bit by bit, making her feel hot. Seeing that she was in a frenzy because of him, the emptiness in his heart was slightly filled. At first, it was gentle and unrestrained love, but later, he became ferocious and tortured her for the whole night. At dawn, they hugged each other tiredly. Then he remembered that he didn't have any protection tonight and she wasn't in her safe period. She lay in his arms and felt his tension. She probably guessed what he was thinking. So she said softly, I will take the medicine. His body became even more tense. After a long time, he said in a low voice, don't take it. If you are pregnant, then let's give birth. Yi Liangqiu was a little surprised. He knew. Qin Anlin's voice was a little low. Won't taking the medicine cause menstrual cramps? It won't happen if you pay attention. She sighed softly and turned her back to him. She wanted to cry, not for herself, but for him. She clung to his warmth, but he had gone through so much struggle to hug her. Even if he didn't say it, she knew. Their union was originally sinful, in his heart. But she couldn't say anything. He hugged her from behind, but she didn't struggle and let him hug her. His face was buried in her neck, and his voice was a little hoarse. Yi Liangqiu, you have to live well, because I haven't forgiven you. Her body trembled. After a long time, she choked back her sobs. Qin Anlin, you too. They could only use this method to love and kill each other. Perhaps this was the only way to alleviate the evil in their hearts and make it easier for them to hug and comfort each other in this dark night. The sky gradually brightened, but they hugged each other and slept until it was almost noon. When they woke up, their expressions were thought-provoking. His voice was a little hoarse. Sleep a little longer. He stood up. Yi Liangqiu held his hand and hesitated for a moment. Help me buy medicine. His eyes were burning. Are you sure? She didn't say anything. He kindly reminded her, if you have another child, your life might be better in the future. She snorted coldly. I might not lose. He smiled. Let's wait and see. However, he still respected her wishes and bought the medicine for her. On the way back, he specially called Dr. May to confirm that the medicine would be fine. Dr. May was a little speechless. Didn't they say that they hated each other? It had only been a few days, and they were together again. Chapter 1708. Qin Anlin looked at her deeply and went out. Half an hour later, he came back with a small box of morning-after medicine in his hand. When she took it, he reminded her again, you can't take this medicine often. Remind me to take precautions in the future. Yi Liangqiu lowered her head and didn't say anything. She just ate the medicine quietly. He was annoyed and walked to the door. I'm going to cook. After taking the medicine, Yi Liangqiu looked in the direction of the door. After a while, he came back. There was breakfast in his hand, which was her favorite. I haven't brushed my teeth. She looked up at him. Qin Anlin's gaze was calm. Put it here and go brush your teeth. He paused and said stiffly, lie down after eating. This time, he really left. She could occasionally hear him talking to the children from afar, but her heart was incomparably satisfied. She understood that this was the best he could do for her. She should be satisfied and not be greedy. It was his struggle, his pain, his hatred that came and went with her, She thought about comforting him. But in this world, she was the one who was least qualified to comfort him. Perhaps, every time she obeyed his wishes and gave in to his body, it was partly because of guilt. Hugging the quilt, she ate the breakfast he bought and lay down for a while. Indeed, her legs were sore and a little painful. It was as if he had eaten the last meal and didn't know the next one. Lying down like that, she actually fell asleep. When she woke up, it was already 2 in the afternoon. There was a faint smell of food in the air. She sat up and felt that her body was a little sticky. When she touched it, she found that it was all sweaty. As soon as she woke up, Qin Anlin came in and looked at his watch. You slept for 3 hours. She was a little surprised. Have the children eaten? He replied absent-mindedly. Looking at her sweaty forehead, he frowned. Go take a shower and eat. After a pause, he said, I have something to do in the afternoon. I'll send you back later. Yi Liangqiu's body stiffened. The quilt was originally very warm, but now it was as cold as ice. Just like that, 2 beautiful and peaceful days passed by quickly. Was this the last warmth of his charity? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and nodded. Okay. She went to the bathroom and unbuttoned her pajamas. Standing under the shower, her eyes were a little sore. I promised not to cry. His body was pushed away by something, and behind him was a cold wall. He was wearing a shirt. At this moment, it was already a mess. It stuck to Jing's sturdy body, and also stuck to her. The thin layer of fabric couldn't block anything. She could feel the heat of every inch of his skin. She raised her head, and the water droplets flowed down her cheeks, to her neck, and finally to her beautiful collarbone. She looked up at him hopelessly. His eyes were burning. Her fair fingers tightened around his shoulders, and his shirt tightened under her hands. She pressed her face gently against his chest, pursing her lips tightly, and hugged him just like that. He was very restrained, but soon after, he didn't hold back anymore. He leaned forward and kissed her lips. Once Yuang's floodgates were opened, he couldn't control himself anymore. He held her shoulders, and his handsome face was a little twisted. After that, he vented all his frustrations on her body. Chapter 1709. When everything calmed down, her body softly rested on his shoulder. Because of the pain, she bit him, and he carried her to the bathroom to wash her up. He then helped her put on her clothes. She knew that this was his last act of tenderness. She hugged him, her body so soft that he didn't want to let go. But even if he didn't want to let go, he had to. When she finished her meal, he walked her home himself. Yi Liangqiu stood at the gate of the Su mansion, and watched him leave with her own eyes. The black sports car sped away. She stood there in a daze for a while. The next day, she found out that he had gone abroad with Xia Mian to a high-end fashion show in Paris, France. In the live broadcast, the officials gave him a close-up, so she could see clearly that it was Qin Anlin. He walked down the red carpet with Xia Mian, and they looked like a perfect match. He was wearing a formal suit, while Xia Mian was wearing a starry Dior dress. She looked very beautiful and elegant. Yi Liangqiu sat on the sofa and watched quietly. She knew that Xia Mian hadn't been abandoned by King Entertainment. She could tell from the fact that Qin Anlin escorted her personally. And behind all of this was Yi Liangqiu's previous identity as a celebrity. Xia Mian. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. 2 days after Qin Anlin went to France, something happened to Keim's family. Keim's mother had a stroke 2 years ago. This time, the weather was too cold. One night, the heater in the bedroom wasn't turned on, but the nanny didn't care. Mother he then left the world. When she left, she was very peaceful. Keim went to France with Qin Anlin and couldn't make it for a while. Keim's hometown was very far away. After the nanny called her husband, Keim asked Yi Liangqiu to take care of the family for him while he rushed back. In fact, Qin Anlin and Keim had important business in France. They weren't going to walk the red carpet. When Keim returned to China, Qin Anlin couldn't leave and stayed in France. Yi Liangqiu was in B City. According to the information provided by Keim, she contacted Keim's relatives in his hometown and arranged for a special car to pick them up and a hotel. In addition, Mama He's funeral arrangements had been made. She had done all this not only because of her relationship with Keim, but also because of Su Qing. Su Qing would be able to come out after 8 years, but now, Mama He had left. How could they not sigh? Mrs. He had always been against Su Qing and Keim. Now that she was gone, Su Qing should meet her. It was her last consolation to He Mingming's mother. Perhaps, He Mingming's mother had already succumbed to her son. After all, in the past 2 years, she had never mentioned setting up a blind date for Keim. Yi Liangqiu used all her connections to get Su Qing to come out for 2 days. Su Qing had arrived that night. Keim arrived at the same time. They met downstairs. He was covered in dust and grief, but he couldn't hide his elite aura. As for her, she was wearing a cheap and simple down jacket. Her long hair had been cut short, and she looked like a little girl from the countryside. She didn't look like a little princess at all. Her face was no longer as delicate as it used to be. Su Cheng's lips trembled slightly. She stood there and didn't go forward for a long time. Kaim stopped in his tracks and looked at her intently for a long time. Finally, he took a step forward and said, "Go in." He reached out and held her hand. Su Cheng's hand tightened. She looked up and looked into the distance. They hadn't seen each other for almost a year and a half. The feeling of being together was almost forgotten, but at this moment, he held her hand. It turned out that the past had always been there. Chapter 17:10. Su Cheng lowered her head and looked at the pair of large palms that were holding on to her hands. A thin layer of mist appeared over her eyes. She was hesitating because she was still serving her sentence. Could she really go see his mother? Her footsteps paused and Kaim knew what she was thinking. He did not stop and chose to take the stairs. After climbing more than 10 flights of stairs, he managed to convince her in that short 5 minutes. In the end, my mother agreed. His gaze softly told her. Su Cheng's palms were sweaty and slippery. She instinctively tightened her grip on Kaim's hand. He was in front while she was below him. She could look up at his back. "Ching Ching, call me Shuheng from now on." When they reached the entrance of his apartment, he turned around and looked at her. His face was solemn, but there was a gentleness in his eyes. She could understand that gentleness, but it was unfamiliar. Her long prison life had long since worn away her pride and drive. The current Su Cheng was no longer the same person she used to be. Even when she stood beside him, she looked crude. She replied with an However, when she looked up at the high-class door, she became timid again. Now, she had nothing and her identity was like this. His apartment was filled with his family. She was afraid that others would look at her in that way. What she was even more afraid of was that they would look down on him because of her. Su Cheng hesitated, but her hand was held tightly. Kaim's voice was firm. "For me, you and He Huan are the people closest to me." He Huan. Their child's name was He Huan. Su Cheng felt like crying. She did not even know her child's name. "Let's see him." Kaim smiled bitterly. "I'll go see my mother one last time in a while." He opened the door firmly. Inside the apartment was his family. Under the many questioning gazes, his hand did not let go of Su Cheng's hand. A sharp cry rang out. It was his little aunt's voice of disapproval. She had objected on behalf of his mother. However, he had made his choice clear. He personally put a small white flower on Su Cheng's head. Together with him, as her son and daughter-in-law, she sent He Mingming's mother on her last journey. Amidst the flames, he burst into tears. Su Cheng turned to look at him and pressed her face against his chest. Before the cemetery was completed, Mrs. He's ashes were stored in the Anling Tower. After sending off his relatives, Kaim thanked Yi Liangqiu. The car stopped in front of the apartment, and Yi Liangqiu got off. She looked at them and smiled faintly. "I'm not going up." "My condolences, Kaim." Kaim nodded. Su Cheng held his arm, and her gaze seemed light under the moonlight. At that moment, it was as if the old Su Cheng had returned. Yi Liangqiu watched quietly, then waved her hand. "I'll come over tomorrow afternoon." Su Cheng's eyes were red as she called out to Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu felt bad too. She nodded and walked over to Su Cheng. She reached out to wipe the tears off her face. "Silly girl, why are you crying? It wasn't easy for us to see each other." She looked up at Kaim again. She was afraid that Kaim's mother would leave. She was afraid that Kaim would be emotionally unstable. Fortunately, Kaim knew his mother's health better than anyone else. Perhaps this accident was within his expectations. He nodded at Yi Liangqiu, and Yi Liangqiu was relieved. She got into the car and left. On the way out, she wound down the car window and let the night breeze caress her face. Chapter 17:11. Before she knew it, her face was already covered in tears. These tears were for Su Qing, but how could it not be for herself? Meanwhile, downstairs, Kaim slowly held onto Su Cheng's hand. His gaze fell on her face, which was no longer fair, but rather a little dark. She seemed to have matured a little, and was no longer as childish as before. She was somewhat mature, so mature that it made his heart ache. Perhaps this was the reason why he had not dared to look at her for the past year. "Ching Ching, let's go home." His voice was soft. She could not believe it. Home. Could she really do it? My mom agreed. Didn't you hear what she said? Kaim's voice was rather relaxed, and there was no special sorrow in it. It was also because Mama He's health had not been good these past few years, and she was often sick. Sometimes, it was a form of relief for her to leave. When he said that, Su Qing stopped in her tracks. She looked left and right, and the expression on her face was much more varied. She did not look like she had when she first came back. Did she say it? She swallowed hard, and her face was filled with, "Don't scare me." Kaim smiled faintly. "I heard it anyway." They walked into the elevator, and when they reached his floor, they opened the door and entered. As soon as they entered, she was dragged inside, and her body was pressed against the heavy door. He hugged her, and his head was pressed against her neck as he breathed lightly. He didn't say a word. He just hugged her, hugging her gently. At first, Su Cheng was not used to it. After all, they had not seen each other for a long time. It was a little strange, and she was also a little shy. But after a while, her hands hesitantly hugged his waist, and her face was buried in his shoulder. Just like that, the hug became tighter and tighter. Finally, as if he could not control himself, he kissed her lips. It was as if all the passion had been ignited. This kiss was light at first, mixed with the pain of his mother's death, and the long-lost feelings. At first, she did not dare to respond to him, and she had forgotten how it felt. But he was very patient, and he led her over and over again. Finally, her hands climbed up his neck. He lifted her up and carried her to his bedroom. She covered her eyes with her hands, not daring to look at him. "Shuhing, don't, why?" He firmly removed her hand, intertwined his fingers with hers, and fell down together. His gaze was gentle as he took off her coat and sweater with one hand and threw them at the end of the bed. Then it was his, piling up one by one, until it became a mess. She put her hand over her heart nervously. "Don't look." "Why?" His voice was hoarse. "Why won't you watch?" Su Cheng's voice trembled. "Because it's ugly." Her body was no longer as beautiful as it was in the past. After giving birth, there were some fine lines on her body. It was very ugly. Even she felt that she was ugly, let alone a man. However, Kaim firmly removed her hand and raised it high above her head. She closed her eyes in shame and turned her face away. "Don't look. Ching Ching, you're beautiful, really." He moved closer to her ear. "Tonight is not a good time, but I miss you." The two of them only had this one night. She did not know when they would meet again. Even He Huan, she only glanced at him from afar. She refused to look anymore and let someone carry her away. How could he not know what she was thinking? Although the child was young, she did not want it to be tainted by her. Chapter 17:12. Just as he had said, it wasn't a good time. But after tonight, there wouldn't be another night like this. He was very gentle, afraid that he would scare her. Su Qing wasn't the Su Qing of the past. She had been extremely reserved the entire night. She was extremely jerky, but it was precisely this jerkiness that made her look especially gentle and alluring. After a few rounds, she lay in his arms, drenched in sweat, her slender arms wrapped around his waist. She was obviously very sleepy, but she couldn't bear to sleep. Kaim was the same. He was leaning against the headboard, holding a cigarette in his hand. He didn't smoke much, and his gaze was lowered as he looked at her. Su Cheng looked up, her eyes glistening. "Shuheng, if there's a good woman, then let's get together. Don't worry about me." Kaim paused, his gaze lowered as he looked at her for a long time. After a long time, he finally said, "Are you sure?" There was a hint of imperceptible sternness in his voice. Su Cheng grunted and said slowly, "I still have 8 years left. I can't get any more reductions." "So, you're afraid of dragging me down? Is that so?" he asked very softly. Su Cheng didn't deny it. "Then what are you doing now? Did you come out from there just to have a PvP?" His tone was very rude and not very pleasant to hear. Her eyes widened slightly. She couldn't believe that he would say such a rude word. Her chin was pinched, and his gaze was burning. "Su Cheng, you think you're doing this for my own good? Just like back then, you turned yourself in and wanted to help everyone. Have you ever thought about me?" His voice became deeper and deeper, until it was almost hoarse. She wanted to retreat, but he held her waist, and she was pinned down again. His fingers pinched her cheeks, and there was an unusual fervor in his eyes as he muttered, "Don't even think about leaving me again." He angrily blocked her lips and kissed her mercilessly, as though he was punishing her. Su Cheng couldn't struggle, and she didn't want to struggle. When his anger subsided and his face was buried in her neck, she caressed the back of his neck with her fingers and comforted him softly, "I won't go." She suddenly hugged his neck tightly and cried, "Kaim, I'm not leaving. I won't leave again unless you kick me out." She hugged him like a child. After such a long separation and so many changes, she would also be afraid if she couldn't see him. "Kaim, I'm scared too. What I'm most afraid of is that you look at me with contempt. What I'm most afraid of is that you don't want me anymore. What I'm most afraid of is that you think it's a disgrace to have such a mother and won't let me see He-Huan." However, he still wanted her. He actually wanted her. How happy she was right now. Her eyes were filled with tears and they stained his neck. It was wet and warm, making him feel extremely uncomfortable. He turned her little face and kissed her forcefully. Their long-awaited bodies were once again entangled together. That night, they were each other's consolation as they licked each other's wounds. From night till dawn, they didn't separate at all. However, she only had 2 days. At 2 in the afternoon the next day, Yi Liangqiu came over as well. Kaim drove her to the northern suburbs. When Su Cheng was about to enter, she turned around and looked at Yi Liangqiu. She mouthed something silently. Yi Liangqiu didn't hear it clearly, but she understood what Su Cheng meant. She nodded as her eyes misted up. She thought that compared to Su Cheng, her relationship with Anlin was nothing. Chapter 17:13. Su Cheng stood outside the high wall with tears in her eyes. She looked at Kaim and didn't move for a long time. Kaim closed the car door and walked over slowly. He held her shoulder gently and pulled her into his arms. "Shuheng." She rested her face on his shoulder and said in a low voice, "Don't be too nice to me. I'm afraid I won't be used to it." She still had to go into atone for her sins. It was tough inside, but her heart was calm. It seemed that with every minute of suffering, she was one step closer to him. She took a step back and looked at him with clear reluctance in her eyes. She lowered her head and looked at his neck. When she looked up again, her eyes were resolute. Take care of our child. She finally dared to say to him, wait for me to come back. Kaim stood and didn't say anything. He only squeezed her hand. She was about to leave, but he didn't let go. He said in a hoarse voice, I'll come and see you. Su Qing didn't say anything else. She retreated bit by bit, leaving his world and his warmth. She really shouldn't come and see him often. She said softly, it's okay. She smiled sweetly at him. Kaim watched her leave with tears in his eyes. His mother had left and he had to see her again. If it weren't for Liangqiu, he might not have had the courage to do so. He only turned around when he couldn't see Su Qing anymore. Yi Liangqiu stood beside the car and looked straight in the direction where Su Qing had left. When she met Kaim's gaze, she pursed her lips and smiled. Let's go back. It would take 2 hours to drive back to the city. There was a traffic jam at night and they might not be able to reach there by 8 o'clock. Kaim nodded, but he still turned around to look at the high wall. The woman he loved the most was trapped here. On the way back, Liangqiu was still driving. She was afraid that Kaim wouldn't be able to concentrate, so he was obviously distracted. We still have a chance to see each other in the future, she comforted him softly. In the past, Kaim had helped her a lot. What she was doing now was just scratching the surface. Kaim smiled bitterly and raised his head. Tears welled up in his eyes. He let out a long sigh. It's so bitter inside. How could she get used to it? Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and replied after a long while, it's impossible for her to get used to it. She's just getting used to it. She paused for a moment. Kaim, she just wants to turn herself into the best Su Qing, to match you. How could he not know? It was just that the price was a little too high. As the car sped along the highway, Kaim's voice suddenly rang out. He went to France for something more important. It's not what you think. Yi Liangqiu tightened her grip on the steering wheel and smiled nonchalantly. You mean President Qin and Xia Mian are sharing a room in Paris? She said it casually. Kaim tilted his head and stared at her for a long while before saying, President Qin doesn't have that kind of feelings for her. Really? Yi Liangqiu didn't speak and focused on driving. It wasn't until they reached his apartment that she turned her face and said softly, Kaim, that's not important. What's important is that if the ATV can't be kept, I don't have the right to question who he's with, right? Kaim's face twisted and he sighed. I might have to offend you later. Yi Liangqiu smiled and changed the topic. Go back and have a good rest. Chapter 17-14. Kaim nodded and got out of the car. Yi Liangqiu sat in the car but didn't get out immediately. Instead, she took out a magazine from the cabinet in front of her. She opened it and saw that the first issue was about the scandal between Xia Mian and Qin Anlin. In front of a hotel room in Hong Kong, Xia Mian and Qin Anlin stood side by side. Although they didn't do anything inappropriate, the sight of a man and a woman standing in front of a hotel room at midnight was enough to arouse people's imaginations. Yi Liangqiu stared at it for a long time before putting it down and starting the car. Qin Anlin came back on the 6th day of the new year. Xia Mian accompanied him, but as soon as they got off the plane, they were surrounded by reporters. Qin Anlin didn't take the same passage as Xia Mian. He left through the VIP passage. When Xia Mian was being interviewed by the reporters, her eyes were filled with tears. I think everyone knows that I was cheated by a scumbag. It was President Qin who comforted me and taught me a lot, taught her a lot. The reporters were imagining a drama. Did he comfort Xia Mian in the same room and teach her a lot? The reporters didn't let it go, but Xia Mian didn't say anything. She smiled and quickly left the airport. This kind of report was overwhelming, the 8th day of the new year. In the top floor office of the ATV, Linda threw a newspaper on the floor and said angrily, "Xia Mian is so shameless. She directed and acted on her own." She really didn't understand why Qin Anlin kept Xia Mian's bad hand. She didn't understand, but Yi Liangqiu did. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. "Because he knows that I care about Xia Mian. If he wants to deal with me, of course he'll pick something that makes me uncomfortable and disturb my mind." Linda's neck shrank. He doesn't care about his reputation. When has President Qin ever cared about his reputation? Yi Liangqiu sighed. Only by letting Xia Mian create a scandal can she maintain a certain level of exposure. Also, Xia Mian probably needs to change her style. Look at her on the cover of the men's clothing issue. It's a big deal. Linda paused. Anyway, I hate this woman. Yi Liangqiu glanced at her. As long as President Qin doesn't hate it. These words are a bit sour. Linda thought immorally in her heart. However, Linda mentioned something else. "Mr. Yi, President Su came to me a few days ago." Yi Liangqiu glanced at her. "Why?" Linda pursed her lips. "He asked me about your relationship with President Qin. I'll just tell you the truth. You're my personal secretary. There's nothing you can't say." Yi Liangqiu said indifferently, "If I hide everything from you, then there's something wrong." Linda said, "Oh." Yi Liangqiu closed the document in front of her. King Entertainment is about to announce a full acquisition of ATV. Inform all the departments to be more cautious from today onwards. Especially any contact with King Entertainment, they have to go through me. Linda asked softly, "What Mr. Yi means is that we can't let King Entertainment succeed." "Of course." Yi Liangqiu stood up slowly. "I'm the CEO of ATV." Linda nodded. Although she didn't know, she was on Mr. Yi's side. Whatever Mr. Yi said, she would do. At the beginning of the new year, King Entertainment began to completely ban ATV. Many of the artists who worked with ATV also backed out of their scheduled shows. ATV's purchase of broadcasting rights was also repeatedly blocked, and the resistance came from King Entertainment. Chapter 17-15. Ever since ATV had been acquired by King Entertainment, its shares had plummeted and everyone was in a state of panic. ATV was unprecedentedly tense and uneasy from top to bottom. The senior management who owned shares had begun to contact King Entertainment secretly, intending to sell their shares. They all had their own plans. Although Mr. Yi was capable, King Entertainment had first-hand resources. Many of the film and television productions were produced by King Entertainment. If they were to go head-to-head, Mr. Yi might not be their match. The storm lasted for more than a month. Even Su Shiqing had personally come to the company twice to express his condolences, but Yi Liangqiu had dismissed him on the grounds of fair competition. When Su Shiqing left, although he was unwilling, it wasn't wise to let him drag his injured body to take charge of the overall situation. ATV would only die faster. He was a little annoyed. He had seen ATV prosper before. How could it fail just like that? Su Shiqing left the office. Linda sent him off and came back. "Mr. Yi, I secretly overheard Mr. Su talking to a few important shareholders just now. Those few said they wanted to replace Mr. Yi. They all thought that it was because of Mr. Yi that King Entertainment kept their eyes on ATV," Linda said carefully. Yi Liangqiu lowered her eyes. "Then go and check the shares of those shareholders." Linda's eyes widened. She looked at Yi Liangqiu in disbelief. "Mr. Yi means, I think their shares have already been sold." Yi Liangqiu's tone was very calm. Once you found out, let Su Shiqing know. It's better for him to clean up the mess himself. Linda nodded. Okay. She went out for half an hour. When she came back, her expression was very ugly. Yi Liangqiu only needed to glance at her to know that she had guessed correctly. Sure enough, those people had sold their shares. They were forcing Su Shiqing to kick her out of the picture. This was probably Qin Anlan's idea. But she didn't understand. Was Qin Anlan unwilling to be her enemy, or was she a difficult opponent for him? She would rather believe the latter. Su Shiqing, on the other hand, was very fast. He quickly cleaned up the traitors. Not only that, Linda also explained in detail Su Shiqing's methods. Behind the scenes, those people did not have a good ending. This was his usual style, and Yi Liangqiu was not surprised. Of course, this also shocked the other shareholders who wanted to betray ATV. Those few people were a bloody example. Linda was a little scared. Mr. Yi, the CEO wasn't like this in the past. Yi Liangqiu knew what she was thinking. She smiled faintly and poured a glass of water for Linda. In the future, when Su Shiqing asks you about me, you just tell him. There's nothing he can't know. Linda held the glass of water and looked at Yi Liangqiu for a long time before nodding slightly. I hope you'll be fine. Yi Liangqiu still had a faint smile on her face, but there was a hint of loneliness in her smile. Because there were too many people who had left her side. ATV, under the attack of King Entertainment, was in a precarious situation. And the entertainment industry was a place where people supported the strong and trampled on the weak. If things got worse, it would only get worse. In the end, it was to the point where ATV couldn't even hire celebrities even if they spent money to shoot dramas. As for ATV, once its capital was exhausted, it could close down. Chapter 17-16. She wasn't a good drinker to begin with, but even with a good stomach, drinking like this would cause her to have problems sooner or later. That night, it was a dinner party with ATV's biggest partner. She wasn't feeling well, but she forced herself to come. Linda was quite angry. In the past, Mr. Yi wouldn't need to beg these people. Now, they were all good and bad, sponsoring the title sponsorship, and asking Mr. Yi to endorse their products. Moreover, the other party was a bath brand under Procter & Gamble. Filming this kind of advertisement meant that they had to take off their clothes. As for how much they had to take off, it would depend on the effect. This is simply taking advantage of the situation. Linda and Yi Liangqiu walked out of the private room together. She supported Yi Liangqiu and said angrily, Mr. Yi, why did you agree to him? Yi Liangqiu's hand was on the wall. If the title sponsorship of ATV's ACE program doesn't renew the contract, it will be the last straw that breaks ATV's back. Linda understood. She just didn't want Mr. Yi to feel wronged. Mr. Yi. She still remembered watching Mr. Ye's movies before. They were so dazzling, but now, he was bowing down to those people for ATV. Yi Liangqiu patted her hand. Go to the parking lot and drive the car to the entrance. I'm going to sober up. Linda was worried, but she looked again. Fortunately, Mr. Yi wasn't too drunk, so she left first. Linda left first. Yi Liangqiu leaned her back against the wall for a long time before she moved to the bathroom to wash her face with cold water. But just as she moved, her eyes froze. In front of her stood Qin Anlan and of course, Xia Mian. Qin Anlan was wearing a gray sweater, black trousers, and a coat on his arm. Although it was simple, he still looked outstanding. Xia Mian was much cooler. She wore a black dress with a coat draped over her shoulders. Her brown curly hair was much more exquisite than before. Yi Liangqiu only took a glance and knew that the coat was from the brand she usually bought. She did not make a sound and only stared at them. Qin Anlin only paused for a moment, then walked over. He brushed past her. When he walked past her, she could feel the coldness from his body. When he walked past her, Xia Mian gently placed her hand on Qin Anlin's arm. She then smiled sweetly and said, "Mr. Yi, are you eating here too?" Compared to her sweet and charming appearance, Yi Liangqiu was in a sorry state. He was wearing an ordinary turtleneck sweater, and his long hair was casually let down. His jacket was in his hands, and the smell of alcohol was overwhelming. He looked like a complete alcoholic. "I'm done." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and waved her hand as if she didn't care too much. "President Qin. Goodbye." With that, she staggered into the bathroom, ignoring the two people she met by chance. Qin Anlin stopped walking. Xia Mian looked up at him. "President Qin, do you want to go see Mr. Yi? He smells of cigarettes." "Did he get bullied?" Qin Anlin's eyes fell on her face. His gaze was a bit sharp, and Xia Mian did not dare to say anything. However, he walked straight to the bathroom and only said lightly to her, "You go first." Xia Mian smiled triumphantly. So what if President Qin went to see that woman now? President Qin would only hate Yi Liangqiu because of the smell of cigarettes and alcohol. She flipped her hair and pushed open the door of a private room. In the bathroom, Yi Liangqiu washed his face and felt that his head was much clearer. Chapter 17:17. As soon as she looked up, she saw Qin Anlin in the mirror. She paused and sneered. "Is President Qin here to see me make a fool of myself?" Qin Anlin's body leaned against the wall of the bathroom, and his voice was indifferent. "I thought Mr. Yi hadn't reached that point yet." Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. She turned around, leaned her back against the sink, and looked at him. "Then how miserable does President Qin think I should be miserable?" He moved forward, one leg stuck between her body, and his slender body also leaned forward. Such a posture was very shameful. He lifted her chin with a finger, and his gaze was slightly cold. "When the ATV can't be saved, and you're like a stray dog." She lifted her chin along with his strength, and her long black hair spread out behind her. She looked extremely heroic, but because of the alcohol, she looked particularly charming and moving. "President Qin thinks that I will have such a day." She smiled lightly, then wrapped her hands around his neck, and exhaled. "As long as Su Shiqing doesn't let go, I think even if thousands of ATV employees lose their jobs, President Qin probably won't be able to get the ATV." In the face of her teasing, Qin Anlin was unmoved. He stood straight and looked at her coldly. "I don't think Mr. Yi will sit back and do nothing." She smiled lightly and tilted her head. "Don't you think too highly of me, President Qin? I'm not that great." He still looked at her coldly and didn't speak again. Instead, he removed her arms from his neck and said in an almost insulting tone, "Mr. Yi, please behave yourself. A body that has been slept with thousands of times is not that attractive to me." He took a step back, his attitude cold. Her gaze fell on something, and she still smiled lightly. Is President Qin used to saying one thing and thinking another? Then she shrugged. Or is it because of Xia Mian? CEO Qin is infatuated with her body. Qin Anlin pinches her chin. Yi Liangqiu, I don't mind letting you know whether I dare to sleep with her or not. Sleep? She smiled. I also want to test if other men are interested in my body. His gaze instantly turned cold as he forcefully released her chin. Immediately, 5 finger marks appeared on her chin. His voice was as cold as ice beads. Yi Liangqiu, I don't mind letting you know the consequences. What consequences can there be? She said self-deprecatingly, the worst outcome is divorce, isn't it, Qin Anlin? She looked straight into his eyes. Since you're going to do it, be more ruthless. He looked at her deeply. This is the Yi Liangqiu you mentioned. She grunted and then stood up straight. She touched her forehead with her slender fingers and smiled. Yes. She walked forward with her back straight, and her voice couldn't be clearer. Qin Anlin, I'm a little tired of this kind of mutual harm. Her arm was caught by him. She turned her head and looked at the coldness on his face. She was still smiling. Yi Liangqiu, you can also quit. He gave in and gave up the biggest step in Qin Anlin's life. Leave the Su family, leave ATV, and let's be together. She was obviously startled for a moment. When he said together, he meant together. Was it the same as before? Chapter 17-18. She still had to walk the path that she was supposed to walk. She didn't know the outcome, but she would have a clear conscience. She had to get rid of Su Shiqing with her own hands so that they wouldn't face each other and that secret wouldn't surface. She looked down and smiled. Anlin, I don't want to force myself to be your accessory. Also, my surname is Su, and yours is Qin. You know that. With that, she broke free from his hand and walked towards the entrance of the hotel. As she walked, she laughed so hard that tears rolled down her cheeks. She would rather he be cruel to her, and she would rather it end sooner. She was afraid that she wouldn't be able to withstand his hatred. She was really afraid. Qin Anlin looked at her back and slowly clenched his fingers into fists. His knuckles turned white from the force. When he walked into the private room, Xia Mian served the investors very well. She was no longer the Xia Mian she used to be. After what happened with Che Taixian, she couldn't walk the path of a pure and innocent girl anymore, so she simply followed the rules of the entertainment industry. When Qin Anlin walked in, a director of a film and television company greeted him with a glass of wine. President Qin, you're late. You have to drink 3 glasses as a punishment. Qin Anlin was troubled, but he still took the glass and drank 3 glasses in a row. The spicy taste entered his throat, and his Adam's apple moved slightly. It was very tempting. Xia Mian watched him drink 3 glasses and immediately handed him a tissue. President Qin, wipe yourself. Qin Anlin didn't refuse and casually wiped himself. In fact, tonight was also a men's party, but one of them had taken a fancy to Xia Mian, so he brought her here. As for whether Xia Mian was willing, it was up to her. He wouldn't force her. After sitting down, Xia Mian poured him a glass of red wine and said gently, How did your talk with Mr. Yi go? Qin Anlin glanced at Xia Mian and didn't say anything. The others were all experienced people. How could they not know that Qin Anlin was displeased? They were curious as to how a woman like Xia Mian, who had poked President Qin's sore spot, managed to survive in King Entertainment to this day. Maybe the rumors were true. Xia Mian looked a bit like Yi Liangqiu. Since President Qin and Mr. Yi had a falling out, it was a good idea to have Xia Mian by his side. The man who had asked for Xia Mian was a little hesitant. After all, he didn't know what President Qin was thinking. If there was something going on between President Qin and Xia Mian, wouldn't he offend President Qin by taking advantage of her? Therefore, during the banquet, Qin Anlin only said a few words indifferently, It's fine. This was enough to show his stance. President Ding was immediately overjoyed. He repeatedly toasted Xia Mian and made her drink several times. Xia Mian was in a good mood and came here with Qin Anlin, so she didn't think too much about it. During the banquet, she couldn't hold back and said that Yi Liangqiu had accepted a role in a PNG commercial. Other people would feel embarrassed, but Xia Mian really didn't know what to do. If President Qin didn't care, he would have left a long time ago. President Qin wanted to deal with ATV and Su Shiqing, not Yi Liangqiu. What man would want his wife to take off her clothes and shoot a commercial like that? No matter how elegant the commercial was, it was still going to be naked. Men would care and go crazy. Besides, Mr. Yi. Queen Yi, which man hadn't thought of her as a goddess? Chapter 17-19. The activity in the private room went on for 2 to 3 hours. Most of the men in the room would talk vulgarly. Xia Mian had gotten used to it. She quietly played with her phone. Occasionally, President Ding would call her over for a drink. After drinking too much, Xia Mian was a little tipsy. She wanted to leave, but she didn't want to give up such an opportunity. Maybe when she left, President Qin would send her back. Such opportunities were rare. Therefore, she held on until the end of the dinner. But in the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She was 80 to 90% drunk. She didn't even know that Qin Anlin had left. When Xia Mian woke up, she was on the bed in the hotel room. She was only wrapped in a sheet. Her female instincts told her that she had slept with a man. She opened her eyes and closed them again. Feeling the vague sense of fullness, the corners of her mouth slightly curved up. She smelled the refreshing scent of a man. Then, her lips were kissed, President Qin. She was elated and shy. Closing her eyes, she accepted the man's kiss and murmured. But the gentle love she imagined didn't happen. Then, the man slapped her mercilessly, bitch. This voice. Xia Mian opened her eyes and looked at the man in front of her in surprise. It wasn't President Qin, she knew him. People called him President Ding. Why was she in his bed? Xia Mian suddenly wrapped herself in the sheet. Her eyes were full of tears as she stared at President Ding. Her lips were slightly trembling. President Ding was in his 40s. He was actually quite good-looking. His favorite thing to do was to play with celebrities. But he knew which celebrities he could play with and which ones he couldn't. Xia Mian, for example, looked like a virtuous girl, but after watching the video with Che Taixian, she was nothing but a prostitute in his eyes. Since she was a prostitute, she could sleep with him as long as he spent money. President Ding was quite strong. He only had a bath towel around his body. Seeing Xia Mian's reluctance, he straightened up and grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the bedside table. He pulled out a cigarette, put it between his lips, lit it, and took a long drag. Then, he looked at Xia Mian and sneered, "I've slept with you twice." He was quite satisfied with her body. After all, Xia Mian was young and hadn't slept with many men, so she was relatively clean. Besides, it was thrilling to play with a female star, so it didn't matter if he spent a lot of money. Xia Mian's lips trembled even more. She buried her head in her knees and didn't speak. Seeing her like this, President Ding was a little unhappy. With a cold face, he said, "Do you still think that you can climb into President Qin's bed?" Xia Mian pursed her lips, and the color of her lips turned even paler. "If President Qin was interested in you, you wouldn't be in my bed." CEO Ding was expressionless. "Tell me, what do you want before you sleep with me?" CEO Ding was a businessman and a northerner. He was very crude and did not have much literary talent. Thus, he spoke very rudely about such things. Xia Mian couldn't stand it. Tears welled up in her eyes. CEO Ding found her annoying. Wasn't it normal for a female star to sleep with a man? What was the point of making her chastity so obvious? But men often had a deep-rooted bad habit. The harder it was to get a woman, the more they wanted her. Just like now. CEO Ding turned around and wrote a few checks. He threw one in front of Xiao Mian. 1 million. Xiao Mian didn't say anything. 2 million. Another check was thrown. Chapter 1720. President Ding threw down all the checks in his hand. 10 million, do you want to sell it? 10 million. Xiao Mian looked at the checks. 10 million was enough for her to buy a house in B City. She hesitated. President Ding sneered, knowing that she was willing to sell it. He pinched her chin and slowly moved his hand up, squeezing her lips. He stood on the bed, and she knelt on the bed with the checks under her knees. It was as if she was kneeling on the money. Humiliated, but also greedy and eager. Serve me here, and I'll add another 5 million. His rough fingers touched her rosy lips, and his voice was hoarse. Xiao Mian carefully moved over, her fingers lightly. President Ding sneered. He had never failed to take down a female star. He could sleep with whoever he wanted. Of course, he did think about Yi Liangqiu, but it was just a thought. It wasn't entirely because of President Qin, but because Yi Liangqiu gave him the feeling that she was like the bright moon. He could only admire her from afar. Xiao Mian served him well, and he was satisfied. After they were done, he gave her another 5 million. President Ding put on a pair of pants and left without hesitation, leaving Xiao Mian and the 15 million behind. Xiao Mian went to the bathroom and frantically rinsed herself. She could accept that time with Che Taixian was for the role. But this time, she was completely selling her body. She desperately rinsed herself but couldn't wash herself clean. She came out in a bathrobe, and there were checks scattered on the bed, with President Ding's smell on them. Disgusted, she picked up the checks and wanted to tear them up, but she couldn't bear to do it. She had worked so hard to get this money. Late at night, Xiao Mian walked out of the hotel with trembling legs. President Ding was tough, and every time he took her, she felt as if a stake had been nailed into her body. It hurt. But it was even more humiliating. Xiao Mian didn't call her assistant. Instead, she flagged down a taxi. When the driver asked her where she was going, she unconsciously told him Qin Anlin's address. After saying it, she was in a trance, and after a while, she felt bored. But the car had already left, so she didn't stop him. She just looked out the window with her chin on her hand. When the car arrived, Xiao Mian paid the driver and got out. She stood in front of the mansion and looked at the tall building in the dark night. In the past, she could almost come in and out of this place. She believed that if Yi Liangqiu didn't come back, she could enter Qin Anlin's heart. However, Yi Liangqiu came back, and she was struck out so quickly. She really wanted to ask Qin Anlin why did he send her to someone else's bed? Xiao Mian leaned against the cold wall. With a cigarette dangling from her lips, she dialed Qin Anlin's number with the other hand. She knew that he had insomnia. It was Qingxiu who told her that he was still awake at this hour. The call was picked up by him personally. She should be thankful that Yi Liangqiu wasn't asleep on his body. Xiao Mian's voice was a little shrill. Why did you do this? Qin Anlin was indeed awake. He was standing on the balcony of his bedroom, looking at a small dot downstairs with a blank expression on his face. It was Xiao Mian, who was sitting awkwardly on the ground. He knew in his heart that Xiao Mian had slept with President Ding. Since she had slept with him, what was the point of being downstairs now? Pay attention to your identity and your location. His voice was cold, and he was about to hang up the phone. Chapter 1721. Like. When Qin Anlin heard this, a mocking smile appeared on his face. He said slowly, Xiao Mian, you don't like me. You like power. Xia Mian's phone slipped from her hand. Power. Perhaps it was. From the first time she saw him, she had fallen for him. But he didn't want her. He didn't want her. No matter what Yi Liangqiu did or how bad she was, he couldn't leave her. Yes, he loved that bitch. He loved her to death. Xia Mian got up from the ground and walked to the road in a daze. Cars flew past her one after another, and the white lights were so bright that she couldn't open her eyes. But Xia Mian didn't seem to feel it and continued to walk forward like a ghost. She kept murmuring, "I thought too much. I thought too much." Qin Anlin stood on the balcony and looked at Xia Mian, his lips pursed into a straight line. He knew very well that Xia Mian couldn't be helped. Her self-control was too weak, and her personal charm wasn't enough to reach the top. And he hadn't given up on her, probably because she was a little like Liangqiu. After watching for a while, he went back to the bedroom. Lying on the bed, he unlocked his phone and looked at the photos on it. It was a photo of him and Liangqiu in the past. "Do you know you're very hateful?" he said softly as his fingers fell on her face. But no matter how much he said, she couldn't hear him. Did she think he was dead when she wanted to shoot that kind of commercial? Of course he knew that she was forced into a dead end. However, they had the rules of the game, and she had broken them. It was a new week. Yi Liangqiu sat in her office and looked at the report on the table. Linda stood to the side and didn't dare to make a sound. Yi Liangqiu looked up and said calmly, "How long can the series we bought last?" "Less than 2 months. Linda sighed. "Mr. Yi, the director of King Entertainment has an appointment this afternoon. Do you want to meet him? Is there anything important?" Yi Liangqiu's tone was particularly indifferent. She looked down at the report again. Linda hesitated again and again before saying softly, "He said he's here to discuss the acquisition." Yi Liangqiu puts her hand on the table. The sound is not low. Linda is startled and does not dare to say anything. After a long time, he heard Yi Liangqiu's voice, "Let's make an appointment. I also want to meet President Qin." Linda nodded. "I will arrange it." Seeing that Mr. Yi was in a bad mood, she didn't dare to disturb him. She went out and closed the door. After she left, Yi Liangqiu looked up, her brows furrowed slightly. Qin Anlin had already closed the net on ATV, and it seemed that it was time for her to fight to the death. Although it was risky, as long as there was a 50% chance, she would try. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Yi Liangqiu met Qin Anlin in the reception room. Other than Linda and Keim, there was no one else. The atmosphere did not relax in the slightest because of the small number of people. Instead, it was very tense. Qin Anlin directly threw out a document. "This is the 25% of the shares I have collected. I think if there is another 20%, ATV will become the object of King Entertainment." Yi Liangqiu looked down and smiled faintly. "Isn't it too easy for President Qin?" Chapter 1722. So, is this 25% enough to influence ATV's decision? Qin Anlin's voice was still cold. "For example, Mr. Yi wants to personally shoot a commercial. I think it will damage the company's image." Yi Liangqiu smiled. "If President Qin wants to replace me as the CEO, he probably has to listen to Mr. Su. After all, he is the largest shareholder, and President Qin's main purpose today is to acquire. I think it's better to talk to Mr. Su directly." Qin Anlin's eyes were burning. "I know Mr. Yi has a way. But I won't help you." Yi Liangqiu's expression was cold and indifferent. "I'm the CEO of ATV, and I will be loyal to the company." Qin Anlin sneered. Then, you will make thousands of people in ATV pay a painful price. The person who will cause the harm is you. Yi Liangqiu sneered. Since President Qin wants to do it, why pretend to be benevolent? I don't remember you being so soft-hearted before. He narrowed his eyes and glared at her. President Qin, I advise you to be calm. She leaned over and said softly, if you're not afraid of causing a bad impact, you can buy it by force, but I'm afraid that the ATV you buy will be worthless. He also stared into her eyes, and his voice was tense. You don't care. Yi Liangqiu smiled softly. What do I care? President Qin, what I want has always been the same as what you want. She was no longer short of money, wasn't she? Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and looked at her, then pursed his lips and didn't say anything else. The negotiation had broken down. She still had to stand on ATV's side, or rather, on Su Shiqing's side. Qin Anlin didn't force her, which was expected. However, he was still a little sad in his heart. He still wasn't used to it, or he still couldn't accept such a fact. He leaned against the car door and smoked. Kaim sat quietly in the car, waiting for him. Kaim knew very well that President Qin had already shown mercy. If he hadn't shown mercy, he might have used unscrupulous means to suppress them. He rolled down the window, and Qin Anlin handed him a cigarette. Kaim took it and lit it. He puffed out a smoke ring and said softly, Kaim, you've seen everything. Kaim couldn't say anything. After all, it was Boss Qin's family business. Qin Anlin cursed under his breath, opened the door, and got on the car. As soon as the black RV drove away, 2 more RVs drove over and stopped at the original spot. The car door opened and Ah Xing got off first. He welcomed Su Shiqing carefully. Su Shiqing leaned on his crutches and looked at the ATV building. He sighed softly, things are different now. Ah Xing supported him and said softly, Mr. Su, Ah Xing doesn't know about these, but Ah Xing will protect you well. Su Shiqing forced a smile. Yeah, why am I telling you this? You don't know anyway. After he finished speaking, he looked at Ah Xing meaningfully and spoke more slowly. Ah Xing, you seem to be quite happy today. Ah Xing was stunned. After a while, Xing said, Ah Xing is happy to be with Mr. Su every day. You're getting better at talking. This isn't like you. You're not being honest. Su Shiqing glanced at him, but he didn't make things difficult for him. Ah Xing secretly heaved a sigh of relief. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.